The relentless sun beat down without mercy, each day dragging on without relief. The meager water supply barely quenched their thirst, and the hardtack had become inedible, saturated with the ocean's salt water. The men's skin blistered and peeled under the unyielding heat, their lips cracked and parched. Lying in the boat, they were drained of energy, their bodies withered as they daydreamed of distant sanctuaries. The haunting creaks and groans of the boat added a chilling backdrop to their dire situation, amplifying the feeling of hopelessness as they drifted aimlessly into the vast, unforgiving unknown. One of the men on the boat, a mere teenager named Charles Ramsdell, was suffering from agonizing stomach pains due to lack of food. He began to look around, studying the other men, trying to gauge their thoughts. George Pollard noticed this and had a feeling about what was coming next. He thought to himself, "Don't do it, boy. Don't you dare ask that question." He tried to convey his thoughts to young Charles through the look on his face and a subtle shake of the head. He was thinking so hard that he practically screamed out loud, "For the love of God, don't do this, boy!" But young Charles either didn't pick up on George's look or didn't care. Charles cleared his dry, parched throat to gather everyone's attention. George Pollard was already staring intently, silently begging God to stop what was about to happen. The other two looked towards Charles, and he began with a weak, raspy voice.
I think we need to talk about the question.
George put his head in his hands, covering his eyes tightly, praying that he would wake up to find all this a horrible dream. But he knew that was not going to happen. The question was being asked. Every sailor knew about the question, but they never talked about it. Out of fear, it might curse them into facing it. The dread in the air was suffocating as they all realized they had no choice but to confront the unspeakable horror that hung over them like a dark, foreboding shadow. Welcome to the H-Files. I am Mr. Anda, and I am eager to share one of my cherished tales. For those who savor classic literature, a mere glance at the opening line, "Call me Ishmael," is enough to identify the story. This timeless masterpiece by Herman Melville has been a guiding light for me, teaching profound lessons about the consequences of seeking revenge. Imagine my astonishment when I discovered that this captivating narrative was rooted in reality. Ron Howard's film, The Heart of the Sea, artfully portrayed the true events behind the book, although it's common knowledge that Hollywood tends to blur fact and fiction. Today, let's embark on a journey to unveil the actual events that transpired from the beloved story of Moby Dick. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button if you enjoy today's story. Your support helps me create more and better content. Remember, every small action can make a big difference. Now, let's journey back to the early 1800s and immerse ourselves in the incredible resilience and unwavering determination of our ancestors. On an early morning in August of 1819, on the picturesque island of Nantucket, a well-known ship known as the Essex lay moored in the harbor. Her crew was busy readying her for a daunting 2.5-year whaling expedition across the boundless open waters. Despite her 20 years, the Essex boasted a storied history of prosperity, having garnered a reputation as a fortunate vessel through several triumphantly lucrative voyages. The Essex was bustling with activity as it underwent extensive preparations for an upcoming voyage under the command of a new captain. Stepping into the role was George Pollard, Jr., a seasoned whaler with a deep connection to the vessel. Having previously served as the first mate on the Essex's last expedition, this transition represented a profound and proud moment for both father and son, as George Pollard Sr. handed over the reins of the ship's captaincy to his son. George Pollard, Jr., driven by an unwavering determination to steer the 88-foot, 238-ton, three-masted ship to unparalleled success. In his quest for triumph on the high seas, he was fortunate to have the reliable and experienced Owen Chase as his first mate. Owen, a proficient and knowledgeable seafarer who had previously served as the second mate on the Essex's last journey, deeply understood the intricacies of whale hunting. The bond between George and Owen was rooted in mutual respect and trust, laying a solid foundation for the promising voyage ahead. On August 12, 1819, George Pollard Jr. stood on the deck of his ship, feeling the salty breeze on his face as he gave the order to set sail from Nantucket. The 20-man crew, their faces weathered by the sea and their spirits high with the promise of adventure and fortune, eagerly prepared for the 2.5-year voyage ahead. However, the sky darkened ominously 2 days into the journey, and the winds carried a foreboding message of an approaching storm. Despite the crew's apprehension, Pollard, driven by a deep desire to prove his fearlessness and leadership, decided to steer the ship directly into the gale. The storm raged with terrifying fury, unleashing its wrath upon the vessel, tearing through the sails, destroying 2 20-foot whaling boats, and threatening to engulf the ship. It's a common tale of youth and pride, of a young man striving to prove his mettle and assert his authority in the face of danger. Pollard's decision, born of a desire to showcase his bravery, instead led to a harrowing encounter with the forces of nature. The lesson for young men aspiring to manhood is clear. Courage is not proven through reckless acts, but through the wisdom and experience gained from navigating perilous situations. Upon facing the catastrophic aftermath of the storm, and with Nantucket just a few days away, the logical choice would have been to sail back to the harbor for necessary repairs. Yet Pollard considered returning with a damaged vessel and enduring gossip and criticism intolerable. Instead, he resolved to press on toward Cape Horn, believing that he could salvage both the journey and his reputation in distant lands. However, by refusing to acknowledge his mistake and address it promptly, he unwittingly set the stage for a much graver situation that had not yet manifested. The crew's spirits continued to plummet in the subsequent months due to the scarcity of hunting opportunities. However, their determination to overcome this challenge was unwavering. By September of 1820, Captain Pollard navigated the Essex around Cape Horn and along the coast to Ecuador, where the ship docked. Although the captain managed to secure replacements for the 20-foot whaling boats lost in the previous storm, the quality of the new boats was subpar. Additionally, a sailor named Henry DeWitt deserted the ship while in port, leaving the crew dangerously understaffed. Each 20-foot whaling boat required 6 men to operate, and all 3 boats needed to be deployed simultaneously during hunts, leaving only 2 men to manage the Essex. Despite these challenges, the crew hastily refitted the ship and set out once again. Their fortunes began to shift shortly after leaving Ecuador, as multiple sperm whales were sighted, signaling the beginning of an intense hunting expedition. When it came to hunting sperm whales, the strategy might have appeared simple at first glance, but implementing it was a far more intricate and hazardous endeavor. As the lookout perched high atop the ship's mast scanned the horizon, a cry of "Right whale" would ring out when a suitable target was sighted. This signal would propel the crew into action, launching 3 hunting boats, each measuring a substantial 20 feet in length. Each of these boats accommodated a team of 6 men, including a seasoned harpooner whose skill was crucial in the delicate art of hurling the harpoon with precision. As the harpooner readied his weapon, the sleek and ominous form of the great sperm whale loomed ever closer, testing the resolve and skill of the hunters. With a deft aim, the harpooner would release the harpoon, its barbed tip finding its mark in the whale's thick flesh. A robust rope, which had been secured to the harpoon, was swiftly anchored to the boat, tethering it to the formidable creature. In response to the harpoon's sting, the whale instinctively surged forward, its immense power propelling it through the water at a breakneck pace. The 6 men aboard the tethered boat found themselves embarking on a heart-pounding pursuit known as the Nantucket Sleigh Ride, as they were pulled behind the fleeing Leviathan. The Nantucket Sleigh Ride was, in fact, a treacherous pursuit. It involved the intense struggle between the crew and a harpooned whale. If it dove underwater and the men could not sever the line in time, the whale would drag the attached boat and its occupants into the depths, drowning every man on board. This exhilarating pursuit, fraught with danger and excitement, was the defining moment of the hunt for these intrepid seafarers, a test of their mettle and a display of their unyielding determination in the face of nature's might. As the massive whale remained at the surface, its relentless struggle against fatigue and exhaustion gradually led to a complete halt. This was the opportune moment for the experienced men to cautiously approach and deliver the decisive strike that would end the whale's life. Following this, the crew would painstakingly tow the enormous whale carcass back to their ship. Once on board, they would meticulously extract the highly sought-after spermaceti oil from the whale's head, which yielded an average of 45 to 55 gallons of valuable oil from each whale. The Essex lingered in the area for a few days, capturing only a few whales, as they were the dwindling remnants of the once plentiful population. After receiving a recommendation from another whaling crew they encountered in Ecuador, Captain Pollard boldly decided to sail nearly 2,500 miles across the vast Pacific Ocean. Despite the crew's apprehensions about rumors of cannibal tribes in the region, Pollard prepared the ship for its new destination and set course for Charles Island, now known as Floriana, within the Galapagos Island chain. During their time at Charles Island, a crew member named Thomas Chappell accidentally started a fire while attempting to cook food on the dry, parched land. The fire quickly spiraled out of control, engulfing the entire island. Modern researchers now believe this disastrous fire led to the extinction of two unique species native to the Galapagos. The Essex eventually reached its destination on November 16, 1820, and immediately sighted numerous whales. Pollard ordered the crew to lower the boats and joined the hunt himself, leaving Owen Chase and a young cabin boy named Thomas Nickerson on board. Here, my friends, is where the story takes a dark turn. Owen Chase was busy preparing the deck for when the rest of the men returned with their haul of whales in tow. Suddenly, he looked up and saw a massive bull whale lurking just beneath the waves, glaring at the Essex. Without warning, the whale charged, smashing into the ship's port side, then diving underneath and resurfacing on the starboard side. It then swam in front of the ship before turning to face the Essex once again. At this point, I think it best to allow Owen Chase to tell you the horrifying events that followed in his own words.
I turned around and saw the whale about 100 rods directly ahead of us, coming down with twice his ordinary speed of around 24 knots, and it appeared with tenfold fury and vengeance in his aspect. The surf flew in all directions about him with the continual violent thrashing of his tail, his head about half out of the water, and in that way he came upon us and again struck the ship.
After the second attack by the whale, the Essex was in dire straits. Captain Pollard returned to find the ship floundering. In disbelief, he asked what happened, and Chase responded, "We've been stoved, sir." The desperate crew of 20 had no choice but to abandon the sinking vessel. Divided among 3 makeshift whaleboats, the sailors faced a grim situation. 2 boats, replacements from Ecuador after the damage caused by the first storm, were still subpar and leaking. These boats were helmed by Captain Pollard, first mate Owen Chase, and second mate Matthew Joy. Despite the dire circumstances, the crew salvaged essential navigation instruments and rigging from the doomed Essex. They also secured 60 pounds of hardtack and several gallons of water for each of the 3 boats, knowing their survival depended on these meager supplies. The crew divided themselves among the 3 boats, each facing their own challenges. Boat number 1, under the command of Captain Pollard, carried his young cousin Owen Coffin, along with Charles Ramsdell, Samuel Reed, Barzillai Ray, William Wright, and Charles Shorter. Boat number 2, led by Owen Chase, accommodated Benjamin Lawrence, Isaac Cole, Richard Peterson, Thomas Chappell, and Thomas Nickerson, the young cabin boy. Boat number 3, captained by second mate Matthew Joy, carried Obed Hendricks, Lawson Thomas, William Bond, Joseph West, Seth Weeks, and Isaiah Shepard. It was a difficult journey ahead. Both Pollard and Chase had navigational equipment, while Joy did not. Each boat was provided with a single pistol for safety. In an attempt to ensure their collective survival, the three boats tied themselves together, bracing for the challenges that lay ahead in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The men of the Essex faced a daunting choice as they debated their next course of action. The Marquesas Islands, rumored to be inhabited by cannibal tribes, loomed 1,200 miles away, sparking fear and apprehension among the crew. Captain Pollard suggested heading towards the Society Islands, just south of the Marquesas. But again, the fear of cannibals led the men to disagree. In retrospect, Pollard was right. The English had taken over those islands and set up missions there. The men of the Essex would have found safety, food, and water aplenty, and shipping to travel back home. Ultimately, the decision was made to set sail for South America, a grueling journey spanning 2,500 miles. As they braved the open sea, their progress was hindered by their reliance on the wind and their constant uncertainty about their bearing. Faced with the grim reality of their situation, the crew tightly rationed their meager supplies, allocating only a fraction of the necessary provisions to sustain themselves. Each man received a paltry 6 ounces of hard tack and half a pint of water daily, leading to agonizing thirst and the rapid onset of physical afflictions. The relentless exposure to salt water and intense sun caused painful sores to erupt all over their bodies, while their meager rations led to severe dehydration and swelling due to the excessive sodium intake due to their hard tack being soaked in the salty seawater. To compound their misfortunes, on the 17th day of being stranded at sea, one of the replacement boats was faltering, and Pollard's boat was viciously attacked by a killer whale, further jeopardizing their already precarious situation. To make matters even worse, the three boats, being at the mercy of the ocean current and wind, drifted much further away from their target of South America. They were now 3,000 miles away and much closer to the Society Islands. Once again, their fear of cannibalism got the best of them, and they turned away from the island, which was in sight. They were now nearly out of the water and had resorted to drinking their own urine. They could no longer produce saliva in their mouth and were barely able to speak. The men were just days away from death when they caught a break. On December 20th, they came upon Henderson Island. They landed on the island's beach, finding a plentiful supply of fresh water and some small game to eat. Unfortunately, after just 1 week, they had eaten all the birds, eggs, and small game they could find. As a result, on December 26th, they decided to leave the island, with the exception of 3 men who wished to stay behind: Seth Weeks, William Wright, and Thomas Chappell. They were very concerned about their chances of survival back out on the ocean. At least on the island, they had fresh water, and if they were lucky, they could catch some fish. The rest of the men headed back out to sea in their boats, doing their best to make their way now to Easter Island. However, by the 9th day back at sea, the men realized there was no longer any hope of making it to Easter Island. The current was pushing them in the opposite direction. To go from bad to worse, on January 10th, second mate Matthew Joy died of tuberculosis, and the men buried him at sea. Obed Hendricks took over as captain of Joy's boat and quickly realized that Matthew had not been careful with their rations, and what little food and water they had left was all but gone. The very next day, Owen Chase's boat separated from the other two during the night. When the sun rose the following morning, they could not see each other. On January 20th, Richard Peterson, aboard Chase's boat, died, and they gave him a proper burial at sea. 100 miles away, on Obed Hendricks's boat, on the same day Richard Peterson died, Lawson Thomas also passed away. However, because of the lack of food on Obed's boat, Pollard and Obed made the gruesome decision to eat the remains of Lawson's body. On January 23rd, Charles Shorter, aboard Pollard's boat, also passed away, and like Lawson, they had no choice but to eat Charles. Several days later, on January 27th, Isaiah Shepard, aboard Obed's boat, died. He was the third man to be eaten in just 7 days. The following day, Samuel Reed, aboard Pollard's boat, also died and was consumed. On the night of January 29th, Obed's boat, like Owen Chase's before him, became separated during the night. Without any navigational equipment, they had little to no chance of survival. Just under a week later, on February 6th, Pollard's boat was again without food, and the men were starving. One of the men on the boat, a mere teenager named Charles Ramsdell, was suffering from agonizing stomach pains due to lack of food. He began to look around, studying the other men, trying to gauge their thoughts. George Pollard noticed this and had a feeling about what was coming next. He thought to himself, "Don't do it, boy. Don't you dare ask that question." He tried to convey his thoughts to young Charles through the look on his face and a subtle shake of the head. He was thinking so hard that he practically screamed out loud, "For the love of God, don't do this, boy!" But young Charles either didn't pick up on George's look or didn't care. Charles cleared his dry, parched throat to gather everyone's attention. George Pollard was already staring intently, silently begging God to stop what was about to happen. The other two looked towards Charles, and he began with a weak, raspy voice. "I think we need to talk about the question." George put his head in his hands, covering his eyes tightly, praying that he would wake up to find all this a horrible dream. But he knew that was not going to happen. The question was being asked. Every sailor knew about the question, but they never talked about it. Out of fear, it might curse them into facing it. The dread in the air was suffocating as they all realized they had no choice but to confront the unspeakable horror that hung over them like a dark, foreboding shadow. The question was gruesome yet simple. Who would sacrifice themselves so that the others may eat? While starving, Pollard was against this at first, but agreed that if they all drew strips of wood from the ship, whoever drew the short one would be sacrificed. The 4 men took turns pulling a strip. Pollard was horrified when he realized his young cousin Owen Coffin had pulled the short strip. Pollard, who had promised Owen's mother to protect him at all costs, pulled his pistol, saying, "I'll shoot any man who moves on you if you not be okay with your lot." Owen smiled and replied, "No, I like my lot as any other." They next drew lots to see who would shoot young Owen. Charles Ramsdell, Owen's best friend, pulled the short strip. 10 days after they had consumed young Owen, Barzillai Ray died, and his body was consumed, which left only Charles Ramsdell and Captain Pollard alive on the boat. On Owen Chase's ship, the situation had not been any better. On February 8th, Isaac Cole passed away and was consumed. However, on February 14th, Benjamin Lawrence spotted a sail on the horizon, a ship from London called the Indian. Thankfully, she had spotted Owen's 20-foot boat and sailed over, rescuing them. The captain of the Indian later said they were the picture of suffering and misery. 9 days later, a French frigate called the Dauphin happened upon Pollard's boat, rescuing Pollard and young Charles Ramsdell. Unfortunately, Obed's boat was not found until months later, washed up on a remote beach, skeletons still in the boat. No one had survived. But what about Seth Weeks, William Wright, and Thomas Chappell, you ask? They had only been on Henderson Island for 11 more days when a passing ship rescued them, returning them to Nantucket. Only 8 sailors survived the ordeal of the Essex, each dealing with their own psychological scars, but all 8 men eventually returned to the sea, if only for a short time. Captain Pollard returned to sea as captain of a new ship only 8 months later. Unfortunately, he ran the ship aground near Nantucket. As a result, no other company would hire him as captain as they considered him unlucky. He faced a great deal of resentment in Nantucket for cannibalizing his young cousin, and a large portion of his family turned their back on him. Without the prospect of going back to sea, he retired as a night watchman in Nantucket, and every year on the anniversary of the wreck, he would lock himself in his room and fast in honor of his crewmen. Owen Chase sailed the seas for another 2 decades, retiring as a captain and part owner of a whaling company. But he suffered terribly after the Essex ordeal, constantly dealing with horrible headaches and terrifying nightmares. Later in his life, he began hoarding food in the attic of his house on Orange Street in Nantucket and was eventually institutionalized for 8 years, passing away on March 7, 1869. Owen Chase, before retiring, had written down his memoirs of the Essex, and this story made its way to an aspiring writer named Herman Melville, who was so drawn in by the story that he traveled to Nantucket to meet with Captain Pollard, Owen Chase, and any other survivor who wished to talk with him. After hearing their stories firsthand, Herman Melville wrote the book Moby Dick while staying in the coffin home on Nantucket. And this, my friends, is the true story of Moby Dick. I hope you enjoyed it. Please don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, and stay tuned for next week's story.